Every year, the tropical summer brings fear of hurricanes to the Caribbean and eastern United States. They are the greatest storms on Earth. Even the weakest inflict destruction. How can the living survive such storms? Because over the millennia, hurricanes have shaped the biodiversity of the Caribbean itself. The adaptations of life to hurricanes fascinate scientists throughout the Caribbean.
Hurricanes are hard for crocodiles, but no one really knows what happens to them in the swampland.
Hurricanes are part of what make Caribbean islands and rainforests what they are.
It's really hard to say whether a hurricane is a totally bad thing.
Because for better or worse, the wilderness is shaped by the extreme impact of hurricanes. The tracks of the hurricanes of the last 100 years reveal the full story of their frequency and reach. It is simply a quirk of fate that determines the size, power, and placing of each storm's impact. Every year, somewhere in the Caribbean, hurricanes will put the living to the test. Nowhere is tested more often than Cuba, home to a rare survivor from the age of dinosaurs. Here in the remote Zapata swamps are found the last representatives of a reptile that evolved over 135 million years, the Cuban crocodile. Hurricanes are now more of a threat than at any time in their long existence. Toby Ramos is the world's leading expert on the Cuban crocodile.
We're going to go to last year's nest over there to see if it has eggs.
With the Cuban crocodile endangered, the health of nesting sites is vitally important. Nests are checked as part of Toby's conservation program. First, a little negotiation is needed with the guarding mother. The Cuban crocodile's main weakness to hurricanes are their eggs.
The biggest problem with the hurricanes is the raised water levels and the destruction of the vegetation. If that occurs during the reproductive season, the nest gets flooded. The chamber where the eggs are incubated fills with water so that it is impossible to get the gaseous exchange through the eggshell, and there is a high mortality rate. Here, our experience is that if a nest is flooded for more than an hour, the development stops, and there is no gaseous exchange. There is a lack of oxygen, so due to this, the embryo dies.
This nest is still in good health. With the mother keen to return, there's little time for the scientists to check her precious eggs.
The Zapata swamps are the last natural refuge where the Cuban crocodile lives in a wild state. There is shelter to protect them from the torment of hurricanes and winter storm winds. Here in the Zapata swamp, there is a hurricane roughly every 50 years. But during the last 20 or 30 years, we have had one every 4 years.
The increased frequency of hurricane flooding threatens the Cuban crocodile's ability to breed and repopulate the swamps. But this mother's long vigil is successfully nearing its end. Cuban crocodiles have a life expectancy of over 100 years. Time enough for some of these babies to face as many as 25 hurricanes in their lifetime. Practicing newfound aquatic techniques is vital training for these pocket-sized predators if they are to survive both human hunters and hurricanes. To help ensure their future, Toby has been breeding Cuban crocodiles for 30 years, releasing them to repopulate the wilds of the Zapata. When they reach adulthood, hurricanes should be little threat, as long as they have secure aquatic refuge deep in the swamp. But the swamps themselves may be vulnerable. Nearly 200 miles to the north lies the Everglades of Florida, a vast wetland of unique plants that have been hit by several major hurricanes in recent years. At over 1.5 million acres, the Everglades are, in effect, an immense river, with billions of gallons of water moving southwards at only 2 inches every hour. Fueled by warm water, hurricanes lose little or no power as they cross the swamp. The first impact is felt by the mangrove forests, tough trees that grow in salt water and protect the coast for hundreds of miles. Thomas Smith of the U.S. Geological Survey studies the impact of hurricanes on this special wetland.
The mangrove ecosystem in Everglades National Park is critical to a number of species, many of which the normal park visitor doesn't see. An abundance of animal life, wading birds, small passerines, fish galore.
To fully appreciate the importance of the mangroves, you need to go underwater. It is an invaluable nursery and sanctuary for countless marine species.
If the mangroves disappeared, we would lose a whole variety of species. And there is a whole food web based on the decomposition of those mangrove leaves, starting with the bacteria, then going to little marine isopods and copepods, to the small fish that eat those, the wading birds that eat the fish. All of that would be severely, severely impacted.
And just what impact does a hurricane have on the mangrove fortress?
Hurricanes can actually do good things for mangrove forests, and they can do very bad things for mangrove forests. A small storm that comes through and has a smaller storm surge that brings sediment into the forest. You get a thin layer of sediment that comes in that can actually give you a little bit of protection from sea level rise.
But in the hurricane belt, a calamity always threatens. It is simply a question of time.
Hurricane Andrew was a definite turning point for people in South Florida. And I will never forget going through a neighborhood and not recognizing anything, because houses were gone, roofs were gone, vegetation was stripped. Hurricane Andrew did tremendous mortality to the trees. The sediment, the soil that the trees grow in is very soft. And so when a tree starts to sway, it's very easy for it to get blown completely over or snapped in half. So we had areas where there was you know, 50, 60, 80% of the trees were killed outright. Some of those areas have come back, some have not come back. It takes a long time for a mangrove tree to grow. Nature doesn't heal itself overnight.
Storms that reshape entire forests would devastate the urban jungle. Living in these seemingly benign residential areas can be risky, even to birds. Migratory purple martins heighten that risk by choosing to breed here close to hurricane season. In this community of Fort Myers in South Florida, local retirees help research into the birds' travel habits. But first, they have to catch one. For this task, you need more than a little time on your hands. The purple martin's choice of nesting accommodation makes them easier to trap.
Actually, never taken one out.
Ooh, nice.
The nesting of hundreds of thousands of purple martins depends almost entirely on human hospitality, but only for part of the year. Soon the martins will be starting their long journey south, and the veterinarian team hastens to get the tags in place.
We have a program that we are trying to track the purple martin to his home back in Brazil. And we are hoping that we can get some of these birds and put a geo-tracker on their backs.
The aim of the tracking program is to understand the physiological challenges of such long journeys on a fragile 2-ounce bird like this.
Are we good?
Pretty good.
William?
They also take blood samples, and they also put a band on them so they'll know where those birds came from if they should light at another location.
Their life cycle forces them to navigate south across the Caribbean to South America in the peak of hurricane season. Careful veterinary records will help reveal how they endure such travels.
They'll start migrating from Canada in August and pass through here in late August and early September.
It's real good.
Of key interest is whether GPS data shows the purple martin to actively avoid storms by the timing or rerouting of their flight plan.
Are you ready?
Flight affords birds a quick escape route. Yet the Caribbean flamingo is at risk. They live in colonies scattered around the Caribbean Sea, but breed at only 4 principal sites during hurricane season. All the breeding sites are vulnerable to storm landfalls, including at some 100,000 birds, the most important. Rio Maximo in the north of Cuba. Jose Leal is the head of a network of specialists studying the flamingo in the Caribbean. His research site is the Rio Maximo wetlands, where he sees a tangible benefit from hurricanes.
Hurricanes have such a strong effect that we have to see it as a positive that can actually help the redistribution of species. When a hurricane hits elsewhere in the Caribbean, flamingos migrate here to take shelter.
As birds fly in, escaping from hurricanes elsewhere in the Caribbean, the flamingo population at Rio Maximo changes significantly. In past storms, refugees have come from the population found at Rio Lagartos in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Here, too, observers are seeking to understand the effect of hurricanes on the distribution dynamics of flamingos. Alex Zib-Che is an authority in the Yucatan.
When a hurricane is approaching, any flamingos that can try to flee the area and abandon their feeding grounds, leaving for other feeding territories like Cuba, Florida, Texas, or even Venezuela. We know that there are refugee flamingos from the Yucatan trying to escape hurricanes because after the storms, we have reports of sightings and can identify them using the leg rings that we put on them, right here in Yucatan.
Newly ringed juvenile flamingos would be like skittles to a coming hurricane. A bowling ball scattering all in its path. In Cuba, as in every corner of the Caribbean, each new hurricane spreads flamingo populations further and further apart.
Now is not one population, but multiple populations, amongst which the gene pool is shared, and the flamingos have become a species that hurricanes move from one point to another.
The Caribbean flamingo is mainly found along the Caribbean, but there's a little population on the Galapagos Islands.
Almost certainly, this population was driven here by an immense hurricane from the Caribbean.
We suspect this because as late as 1836, Darwin did not describe any sightings of flamingos there.
The ability of flamingos to outfly hurricanes and colonize new territories means that these storms may actually help efforts to expand declining flamingo populations. But hurricanes can be unpredictable and deadly, variable in size, force, and timing. Sooner or later, one will coincide with a flamingo nesting event.
What would happen if a huge hurricane were to come here when the flamingos are in their nesting season? In that event, the flamingos would not flee their nests. How many flamingos would die out of the global population of these species? It would be a grave threat for a species that is already at risk. The most common tendency for riding out a hurricane is to go deep into the closed mangrove lagoons and huddle as a big compact group. We've observed them sheltering like that during a hurricane.
If the mangroves uproot, the hiding flamingos will die.
To safeguard against this fate, as many juveniles as possible are brought into Leal's sanctuary.
Once the hurricane is past, we let them go back to the wild. When there are more breeding places like this in Cuba, there are now 4 where there's breeding every year, and the more there are, the more the threat of hurricanes to this animal will decrease.
For a hurricane to be damaging or beneficial boils down to timing, whether the flamingos are breeding or are free to fly before the storm. The more isolated the land, the harder it is to escape from a major hurricane landfall. Several have hit the island of Puerto Rico. Finding shelter here is vitally important. These hills are riddled with caves, and at night they come alive.
Most species of bats in the continent don't use caves as their main roost. However, when you come to the West Indies,
Most species of bats, they roost in caves.
Armando Rodriguez Duran explores the unique underground ecology.
Living in a cave is an advantage because of the frequency of hurricanes passing through the islands. Caves are a safe place, and they will protect the bats from the wind, from the rain,
and from the effects of any hurricane.
Some of those caves can host populations in the hundreds of thousands. The largest we have ever estimated is over 500,000, but colonies of 100,000, 300,000 are not uncommon in the region. What limits the number of bats in the caves is actually the size of the opening. The cave itself inside has much more space than what the bats are using, but they all have to come out and feed at night. So there's a limit to how many of them can come out in time to actually go and find insects out there.
While Armando takes his measurements, more and more pour out to feed. The 13 types of bats dwelling in Puerto Rican caves fall into two categories. The first are the insect eaters, like these. Sharing a cave-dwelling lifestyle with the bats could prove a risky venture for these honeybees. These are fruit eaters, the second category, seeking to gorge on mangoes, fruit that can be in short supply after a hurricane.
So what we have observed is that insect-eating bats tend to increase in numbers after the hurricane. The fruit-eating bats, on the other hand, what they find when they come out is that many of the trees have been are devoid of fruits, of flowers. Many of the trees are not even theirs. When that happens, they will come out and there will be no food for all of them. And that's when they face difficult times, and you will have high mortality of some of these species due to starvation more than to the hurricane itself. Some of the fruit and nectar feeding bats were the most abundant species in the caves, and then their numbers dropped. After the hurricane, the proportion of insect-eating species went up. As the number of fruit-eating bats went down, the insect-eating bats became dominant. That remains so to this day. So it may have changed the makeup of the cave until the next hurricane.
Elun Forest of Puerto Rico. The tropical rainforest here forms the heart of the island, 28,000 acres that harbor countless lush plants and animals. What would happen if this delicate refuge were to receive a direct hit from a hurricane? Scientists have been investigating this hurricane-prone environment for more than 40 years, led by Ario Lugo.
In 1989, this forest was affected by Hurricane Hugo, and it received the heaviest winds in that storm, killed 37% of the trees, and it has the highest effects that we measure anywhere. So this forest was basically destroyed to a casual observer. When we came here for the first time, many of the employees actually, they cried because they thought that the forest was beyond repair. That's because we had this idea that tropical rainforests were very fragile forests. Well, after the hurricane, we observed that all the big branches in the canopy, all the leaves of the forest were quickly transported into the forest floor. And in fact, if you were sitting here 23 years ago, what you would see behind me would be great piles up of branches and leaves that were previously on the forest canopy. So the forest changed completely in its aspect because from a closed canopy dark forest, it was converted to a very open forest with these gigantic piles of debris. Hurricane Hugo, in 4 hours, deposited on the forest floor the litter, the debris that normally falls in a year. The scientists are trying to explain what are the mechanisms by which the forest recirculates the material that is dumped on the forest floor by the hurricane, and that's what we call the canopy trimming experiment.
To imitate a hurricane on a tiny scale, we need a big chainsaw. It takes a full day to trim a single tree. Hurricanes can destroy entire forests in just a few hours.
The canopy trimming experiment was an effort by the scientists in Puerto Rico to understand what controls the decomposition of the debris piles that are formed after a hurricane. And in that experiment, basically what we did is that we cut the forest and dump on the forest floor the amount that we had observed after Hurricane Hugo, and then study how the organisms responsible for the decomposition, how quickly they operated, how quickly they decomposed the organic debris.
Normally, leaves and branches that age and fall to the forest floor are brown and poor in nitrogen. But a hurricane rips off fresh wood and lush green leaves packed with nitrogen. This fresh debris is a rich source of nutrients, fertilizer to the surviving trees, and resprouting undergrowth. Now newfound sunlight from the storm-opened canopy conjures a magical change.
We were in for a surprise because this forest regenerated so fast at rates that we never even imagined before the hurricane. The material was recycled naturally within 5 or 6 years because that's what hurricanes do. Hurricanes transport a lot of debris to the forest floor where it has to be processed before the forest can return again. So in this forest is where we learn a lesson about the resiliency of tropical forests.
This vigorous forest and its trees have mastered a strong hurricane response, but not all its inhabitants appear so resilient. These torrents hide creatures vital to the health of the mountain streams. Tamara Hartzell-Scally has studied them for many years.
This is a much better spot. We'll put one here. So in the Luquillo Mountains, there are many protected headwater streams, which are important freshwater resources for all the communities and the cities around them. And one of the less known but important charismatic fauna of these streams are decapods, shrimp. We got a lot.
Tamara's passion for these small invertebrates is easy to see. She has identified that each species has a clear-cut function, essential to keeping their river home clean.
A lot of streams are like this size and even smaller, and they can be sometimes completely covered by the canopy and branches of trees. But some shrimp filter the water of the streams.
They are a tireless workforce for water purification.
They consume, it is estimated, between 40 and 50% of the biomass that falls at any given time in a stream pool.
Without these fragile creatures, the streams and headwaters of Puerto Rico would be completely overwhelmed by organic debris after storms and hurricane events, and little clean water would flow downstream. But how do they manage to survive the sudden arrival of severe storms and hurricanes?
People are not aware of how quickly and how high the water can increase with just rainfall that is not even occurring locally, but that may be occurring further up the mountain. Because shrimp are adapted to living in fast-flowing freshwater conditions, they immediately can take cues and change their behavior when you have an increase in flow or you have a change in the turbidity of the water. The shrimp that are usually inhabiting the deeper pools will probably be the ones that stay and hide under boulders. Of course, some are usually carried by the current, but they can step out of the current at some point and leave out.
Shrimp simply avoid the worst impact of the storm floods by walking on land.
And as long as they're wet and they're close to the water, they can migrate and move between pools and escape the current that can carry them away. There's not that much mortality in these events from shrimps just being randomly carried with the water current. The hurricanes give the shrimp the opportunity to recolonize the headwater streams. So in that sense, it's a restarting.
Hurricanes simply provide vast amounts of food for shrimp, the unseen guardians who keep the rivers of Puerto Rico running free. Hurricanes are a great threat to the city of Havana, Cuba. It is home to a world expert coral biologist, Pedro Alcalado, who fears the reefs are equally at risk as the ancient city he lives in.
The marine plate of Cuba is nearly completely surrounded by coral reefs. Out of over 2,000 miles of reef, almost 500 miles are shallow barrier reefs. In Cuba, they are in various states of deterioration. Only 6% of these coral reefs are still in a perfect state of health. The rest is generally quite damaged.
With Cuban reefs in decline, Alcalado leads an expedition to a site that holds a key to understanding the problems. The chosen reef is special because of its protective geographical location in the Ciénaga, which shelters it from most hurricane hits.
There are two reasons why this reef is the best conserved in Cuba and the Caribbean. The first is that its geographical position protects it with regards to the winds. The result is that when there is a passing hurricane, the coral suffers less in comparison to other reefs. There are also nutrients washing out of the soil in the swampland of Zapata, which enrich the water in plankton production that in turn feeds the corals.
A coral reef has naturally evolved to cope with hurricane damage. Branching coral like staghorn are adapted to regrow from any fragments broken off in storms. And on this reef, they're able to do just that. Here on this sheltered reef, even the critically endangered elkhorn is flourishing. On the way back, they stop at a spot that is fully exposed to the worst of the weather. This reef has been heavily damaged by several hurricanes. It shows no sign of any recovery. This is a cemetery.
After the passage of a hurricane, and because of the destruction of the coral, a lot of algae colonizes, as well as other encrusting organisms. This colonization prevents the settling of new coral larvae, which would otherwise have replaced those that have been destroyed. The slowest to recover are the corals and the fish. Of these, the coral are by far the most important because they are the ones that build the structure of the coral reef itself. They are the building stones. If a hurricane comes through every 6 years, this could be a good thing for the reefs. It helps increase the vitality of the coral by fragmenting the branches which fall on the seabed and sprout new growth, propagating and expanding the reef. But on the other hand, if hurricanes hit every year or so, there is no time for the reef to heal, and it slowly levels out, transforming into a debris pile. People often ask themselves if coral are going to adapt to survive hurricanes, and that's not really the right question, because the coral have evolved so that they've thrived during thousands of years of hurricane impacts.
Caribbean reefs should be capable of recovering from hurricanes, but the coral is now so weakened and diseased that once broken, it is incapable of normal regrowth. The reefs have been severely affected by human activities, with sedimentation, pollution, overfishing, global warming, and industry all taking their toll. Every year, the Caribbean islands lie in wait, waiting for the hurricane that sooner or later will surely come. When it does, instincts developed over millions of years will be essential for survival. On the island of Banco Chinchorro, east of Yucatan, 3 major storms have hit in the last decade. Even so, it is still the ideal research home for scientist Pierre Charrouot.
The Reserva de Banco Chinchorro is a very special place due to its unusual features. It's a site that is very isolated from the mainland, and it's a reserve, a protected site. These features mean that you can find significant wildlife diversity here. There is also a well-protected population of American crocodiles, which is unaffected by the intense hunting of the last century. It's a good population to study ecologically.
Pierre spends his nights here, checking for signs of his population of American crocodiles. All the more important because the island was submerged 10 feet beneath the sea during a recent hurricane. This caused a dramatic temperature drop that had a profound impact on the American crocodiles.
This sudden drop in temperature kills the embryos almost immediately, and they can survive below 28 or 26 degrees Celsius.
The American crocodile is adapted for life in salt water. Its eggs can cope with submersion, but they can't deal with sudden cold.
On precisely that night, we found a crocodile's nest. And in this nest, we didn't see a single baby born from that nest. You can see on this egg little marks, and these dark rings reveal that the embryo died right at the beginning of the incubation period.
On the island of Chinchorro, the respite for the crocodiles is short-lived. Tropical weather threatens the archipelago once more. During a recent hurricane, the winds drove a gradual 12-foot sea level rise over the island. With shelter fast submerging, even the adult crocodiles were forced to leave, to seek safe haven.
On immigration journeys, only the biggest individuals can survive at sea for a long time. Individuals over 13 feet long use the currents and can swim for hundreds of miles at sea without a problem.
Running on the seabed, they can work their way along seafloor shelves with minimal effort. Following the currents north, they head towards the Gulf of Mexico. Driven on by hurricanes, the American crocodiles have voyaged successfully at sea, enabling the species to spread and repopulate a wide geographical range that includes Cuba. The success of the arriving American crocodiles comes at the expense of their Cuban cousins. The bigger Americans have interbred with the Cuban species, which could become extinct as a result. There is one final refuge for the Cuban crocodile, from both invaders and hurricanes.
The advantage for Cuban crocodiles living here in the Zapata swamp is that there are cenotes. These are limestone holes filled with water, and when storm events happen, the crocodiles can shelter inside the cenotes without any problem.
But nothing is certain in the Caribbean, where hurricanes are a force of change, a destructive power that forces life to adapt, to mix, to restart. Hurricanes can be lethal at the level of the individual, but planet Earth functions at the level of populations and systems over long periods of time. Change is simply the force of renewal. Even a crocodile has no guarantee of species survival. Hurricanes are agents of destruction and of rejuvenation in equal measure. In the future, they may be more powerful and inflict greater change than even those of today. Can we adjust to match?